All right, welcome to week 16. This week we are looking at foreign and defense policy. This chapter, like the last chapter, I will confess, I think it could have been better done. I think it could have, I teach American foreign policy, so I can spread this one week into a 16-week format very easily. I think it's competent, but it could be better, obviously. Um, a couple of things that I think are interesting about this chapter, the deal with treaties. Treaties have from the start been a particularly cumbersome, uh, you know, issue and process for presidents. And so it's not a terrible wonder that presidents don't often go in for treaties. They much prefer dealing with executive agreements. They're easy peasy. They can run through. They don't have to go through the rigmarole that they generally have to go through with the Senate. I think one of the most famous kind of rejections uh, of a treaty, of course, was the rejection of the Treaty of Versailles, which Woodrow Wilson went to Europe to help negotiate that treaty. He brought it back triumphantly. He believed absolutely that it should have been accepted as it was without any considerations on the part of the Senate. They should have, in his view, they should have simply voted it up or down. He campaigned himself into a stroke, trying to put so much pressure on the Senate that they wouldn't feel comfortable doing anything other than ratifying it. And the reality, a lot of people put a lot of blame on Henry Cabot Lodge, for basically killing it. Lodge actually did support ratification, but he did believe that there needed to be some modifications. And we have to keep in mind, the Treaty of Versailles was fundamentally pulling the United States into the international community after the entire history of American foreign policy following Washington's dictum of avoiding foreign entanglements. So this was not going to be an easy lift for the Senate. And I think Wilson, the combination of his arrogance in thinking that he had the people on his side and in thinking that all he had to do was mobilize them and thus intimidate the Senate into doing it, and the fact that his subsequent illness left Lodge without anyone to negotiate with in the White House, really doomed that bill, and frankly, paved the way to World War II. Um, Another important issue that I think gets addressed in this chapter is the idea of the two presidencies thesis, which was something that Aaron Vildovsky, promulgated in the 60s and 70s. His argument is that presidents have, more prerogative authority, is something that Richard Pius also believes, and many, scholars of the presidency, and that because of that, they generally experience more success in the realm of foreign policy than in domestic policy. The argument being, politics stops at the water's edge. Is that still the case, though? I mean, increasingly we're seeing that politics has become more and more controversial and more partisan in nature as more, as international trade has intensified, as more and more, districts and states have foreign, heavy foreign investment in them. It's become a much more broken field, and it's much more commonplace for members of the Senate, especially, to have a very keen idea about what they think foreign policy ought to be like. I think a classic example of this, and I think should have been addressed much more, in much more detail in the text, is the idea of the Logan Act, where you actually had, as the Obama administration was concluding the Iran nuclear deal, Tom Cotton of Arkansas, with virtually every other Republican senator, sent a letter to the Iranian political leadership, basically telling them that their intention was, as Republicans, to break the deal. I think that was, the only thing that prevents that from being a straight up violation of the Logan Act is perhaps the presumption that members of Congress are immune from prosecution for, doing their jobs. But in this instance, and again, the only reason probably why there wasn't a greater problem was that the Logan Act has really never been enforced. Nevertheless, I think there's a lot of stuff to talk about in this chapter. Donald Trump's various forays into foreign affairs have certainly created a lot of issues that we can talk about, in terms of how effective he has been. I've had some people make the argument that his trade deals, his willingness to break up deals and renegotiate them, has actually improved America's trade imbalance. I would argue that when you counter that with the enormous deficits that he's running due to the tax cuts that he imposed, that's all balanced out. And then when you add to that the fact that right now he is threatening, major countries like China with sanctions if they don't, stop buying Iranian oil. He's trying to recreate the Iran sanctions regime. But it doesn't appear that anyone in that administration, in the Trump administration, really has a clear understanding of what they're trying to do vis-a-vis Iran. I'm not persuaded that anyone has actually articulated a vision of what they think they're going to achieve with these kinds of maneuvers. And when you're messing around with oil and the nexus between oil and politics and economics, you're messing with a very potentially toxic brew. So anyway, I think this is again final week. Great job, guys. Let's finish the drill and have a great week of discussion.